My daughter-in-law had a real estate agent sitting in my living room before the smoke had even cleared my lungs. She called it a sign. She told me, with that little smile of hers, that losing everything I'd built over 40 years was probably for the best. What Lynette never counted on was that I kept records, and I kept copies. And I kept my mouth shut for exactly as long as it took to make sure she had nowhere left to run.
If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. I want to tell you about the smell first, because nothing in my life has ever prepared me for that smell. It wasn't like a campfire. It wasn't like the fireplace on Christmas morning. It was heavy and chemical and wrong in a way that gets into your throat and stays there. That's what pulled me out of sleep at 2 in the morning on a Thursday in October. Not the light, not the sound, the smell. I sat straight up in bed, and my first thought, I swear this is true, was that I'd left something on the stove. That's the kind of thought your brain reaches for when it doesn't want to accept what's actually happening. You reach for the small explanation. You reach for the one that's fixable. Then I opened my bedroom door, and the hallway hit me like a wall. Gray smoke, thick and rolling low, and underneath it, down the stairs, coming from the direction of the living room, a color that had no business being there at 2 in the morning. Orange and dancing and wrong. I didn't scream. I think that surprises people when I tell it. I did not scream. I closed the bedroom door behind me out of pure reflex, like that was going to do something, and I went straight to the closet and I pulled out the suitcase I'd used on my honeymoon. It still had a faded TWA luggage tag on the handle. My husband Raymond had tied it on there in 1979, and I never took it off. My hands were shaking badly enough that I knocked the whole shelf down trying to get it. Picture frames, a shoebox, a sweater I'd been looking for since February, all of it on the floor. I grabbed what I could think of. A handful of photos from the nightstand drawer. Raymond at our wedding, Elliot at age 4 with a gap-toothed smile, a picture of my mother I'd had since before I was married. I grabbed my purse because my purse had my documents wallet inside it, the one where I kept insurance cards and my Social Security card and the deed to the house. Raymond had always insisted on that. Keep the important papers together. Keep them somewhere you can grab them in 30 seconds. 30 seconds. That's all I had. The smoke was denser when I opened the door again. I held the suitcase in front of me and I got low the way they tell you to, and I moved to the top of the stairs. The living room was fully involved by then. I could see the couch, or what used to be the couch, just orange and black and collapsing. The bookcase along the wall, 40 years of books, Raymond's mystery novels, my gardening books, every title we'd read aloud to Elliot at bedtime, already gone. I made it down the stairs and out the front door, and I sat down hard on the porch steps because my legs just stopped working. I sat there for probably 30 seconds before I realized I was barefoot on cold concrete, and the suitcase was still in my hand, and there were neighbors already coming out of their houses. Harriet from next door, 71 years old, still has the fastest reflexes of anyone I know. She had already called 911. She came across the lawn in her housecoat and her orthopedic sandals, and she put a blanket around my shoulders that smelled like fabric softener and cat. I have never been more grateful for any object in my life. The fire trucks came. Men in coats moved around my yard like it wasn't my yard at all, like it was just a job site, which I suppose it was. I stood on Harriet's lawn and watched my house burn. 43 years. That's how long I had lived in that house. I moved in as a 24-year-old bride. I brought my baby home from the hospital to that house. I sat in the living room on a Tuesday afternoon in that house and told my son that his father had died. I had painted those walls 4 different colors over the decades. I knew every creak in the floors. I knew that the 3rd stair from the bottom made a sound like a question mark. And now orange light was coming out of every window, like something terrible was trying to get free. I could think of only one thing. I had to get to my son. Harriet wouldn't let me drive myself. I didn't fight her on it. She drove me in her Buick, the one she'd had since 2009, smells like peppermint and old newspaper. And she kept glancing over at me while she drove like she was checking to make sure I was still there. I told her I was fine. I don't think either of us believed me. It was after 10 o'clock by the time we reached Elliot and Lynette's neighborhood. I told Harriet she could drop me at the corner. She said she'd wait. I said there was no need, I'd be staying with my son. She looked at me for a moment in a way I didn't understand at the time. She waited. Elliot and Lynette live in a brick colonial about 20 minutes from where my house used to be. Nice neighborhood, mature trees. The kind of street where the sprinkler systems run on a timer and everyone uses the same lawn service. The lights were on inside. I could see the flicker of the television through the front window. I rang the bell. I was still in my nightgown. The suitcase was in one hand and my purse was in the other, and my hair was probably, well, I wasn't exactly presentable. Elliot opened the door. He was in sweatpants and a t-shirt, and his expression when he saw me was not what I expected. Not alarm, not relief, not the immediate movement toward me that a mother might hope for. It was confusion. It was, "Mom, what are you doing here?" I said, "Elliot, my house burned down. I have nowhere to sleep tonight." And I watched something happen on his face, some calculation, some recalibration, and then Lynette appeared at his shoulder. I want to describe this carefully because it matters. Lynette was wearing a silk robe, pale gold, very fitted, not the kind of thing you throw on when you're getting ready for bed. Her hair was done, full blowout, not a woman winding down for the night, a woman who had been awake, a woman who was ready. She looked at me and she said, "Burned. How did that happen?" No gasp, no hand to the mouth, no instinctive move toward me. Just that question, delivered in a tone that I can only describe as measured, like she was confirming information she had expected to receive. I said I didn't know. I said I woke up to smoke and the first floor was already on fire. She and Elliot looked at each other. It was fast, that look. A second, maybe less. If I hadn't been watching his face, I'd have missed it. But I was watching, and I saw it. I said, "I can stay here tonight, just tonight. I'll find a hotel tomorrow and deal with the insurance." Lynette turned back to me, and she said, "Teresa, I need you to understand. We have our own responsibilities. This really isn't a good time for us." Elliot said nothing. My son, the boy I had raised from nothing, the boy I had held through ear infections and bad dreams, and the worst night of his life when we buried his father, that boy stood in his doorway and said absolutely nothing while his wife told me to go find somewhere else to be. I tried once more. I said, "Elliot, honey, just the couch, just for tonight." He looked at the floor. He said, "You know how it is, Mom. Lynette's under a lot of pressure at work right now. Maybe you could call a friend." And Lynette, "And I will remember this for the rest of my life." Lynette smiled, small and satisfied, like someone who had just finished a task they'd been putting off. She said, "Besides, Teresa, maybe this is a sign. At your age, living alone in a house that size, this could actually be an opportunity. An opportunity." The door closed. I heard the lock turn. I stood on their porch in the rain because it had started raining sometime in the last hour. And I thought about 43 years. I thought about the suitcase in my hand with the TWA luggage tag. I thought about Raymond, who would have had Lynette's bags on the lawn before she finished that sentence. Then I walked back to Harriet's Buick. She was still there. Of course she was. She didn't ask what happened. She just put the car in drive and said, "You're staying with me tonight." I said, "Okay." And then I cried. Just for a minute. Just the once. To understand how I got to that porch, you have to go back about 6 months. Because nothing that happened that night came out of nowhere. I just wasn't paying close enough attention. Sundays had always been our family day. That was the tradition Raymond and I had established when Elliot was small. And even after he married Lynette, even after they moved into their house, the tradition held. I would come over Sunday afternoons. I would bring something. Usually my peach pound cake, the one with the cream cheese glaze that Elliot has been requesting since he was 9 years old. The table would be set. There would be coffee. We would sit together for a few hours and I would hear about their week and they would hear about mine. That was the idea anyway. The reality in the months leading up to October had gotten quieter. Elliot's hugs were shorter, not cold exactly, just shorter. The kind of hug you give when your mind is somewhere else. And the conversations had started going a certain way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Lynette had begun using a word, confused. She used it lightly, casually, the way you drop a little salt into something while nobody's watching. Elliot, your mom seems a little confused about the dates again. Oh, Mom, don't worry about that. You're probably just confused. You've had a lot on your mind lately. Wasn't it your doctor who said the confusion is normal for someone your age? My doctor had said no such thing. I was 66 years old with a working mind, a garden I maintained myself, and a checkbook that balanced to the penny every month. I was not confused, but there is something about being told you are, repeatedly in a gentle voice, that starts to make you doubt yourself around the edges. She was good at it. I'll give her that. The comments about the house started around the same time. The house was too big for one person. The stairs were a risk. Maintenance costs at my age weren't practical. She said all of this with a kind of tender concern that she'd clearly practiced. She'd tilt her head. She'd say, "Mom, I just worry about you." Elliot would nod. My son, who had grown up in that house, who had learned to ride a bike in that driveway, who had his father's old workbench still set up in the garage, he would nod like it was a sensible concern, and not like his mother was sitting right there. I should have said something sooner. I know that now. I kept thinking the phase would pass, that Lynette would find some other project, that Elliot would eventually hear himself agreeing with things he shouldn't be agreeing with. I waited too long. The last Sunday before the fire, so the Sunday 6 days before everything burned, I arrived at 2 p.m. with my pound cake and walked into the living room and found a stranger sitting in my usual chair. She was in her late 40s, blonde, wearing the kind of blazer that costs more than it looks like it does. She had a leather portfolio open on her knee and a smile that she had clearly spent years perfecting. Lynette said, "Oh, Teresa, perfect timing. This is Marcy. She's a real estate agent. We've been talking about your situation." My situation. Marcy stood up and extended her hand and said, "Lauren tells me you've been thinking about downsizing. Very smart move. The market in your area is strong right now. A house your size, in your neighborhood, you'd probably net close to $400,000 after fees. You could get into a very comfortable senior community for a fraction of that." I looked at Lynette. I said, "I never said I wanted to sell my house." Lynette laughed, that light, practiced laugh she used for situations like this. She said, "Oh, Mom, don't you remember? A few weeks ago you were telling us how worried you were about the heating bills and the roof, and I just thought," I said, "that is not what I said." The room got quiet. Marcy closed her portfolio. Elliot cleared his throat and said, "Mom, let's just hear what Marcy has to say. It doesn't have to be a decision today." I sat down at the table. I ate a piece of my own pound cake. I listened to Marcy talk for 20 minutes about square footage and market conditions and the benefits of maintenance-free living. I smiled when smiling seemed required. And then I drove home. I drove home thinking about the way Lynette had said your situation. Like my life was a problem. Like the house I'd lived in for 43 years was an inconvenience that needed to be managed. I thought about the look on Elliot's face, that careful blankness, the way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. I thought about Marcy with her leather portfolio, already doing math in her head. I got home and I sat in my armchair. The old one. The one Raymond had reupholstered in 1987, the one I refused to get rid of even though the fabric was starting to go on the left armrest. And I drank chamomile tea and I thought, something is wrong here. Something beyond normal daughter-in-law friction. Something that smells like a plan. I just didn't know yet how far the plan went. Harriet's guest room had yellow curtains and a cross-stitch on the wall that said, "Home is where the heart is," and I lay in that bed until 4 in the morning, staring at the ceiling. In the morning, she fed me toast and black coffee, and then she drove me to a comfort inn off the interstate so I could have my own space while I figured things out. The insurance company put me on an emergency living allowance right away. 5 weeks covered. That was something, at least. The room was fine. Clean, forgettable, the kind of room that has no personality and asks nothing of you. I sat on the edge of the bed with my soaked suitcase open beside me and my half-ruined phone plugged into the wall. The screen had a burn mark in one corner from the heat, but it worked. And I thought. I thought about Lynette's silk robe, the blowout, the measured tone when she asked how the fire happened. I thought about the way she and Elliot had looked at each other that split second. I thought about Marcy and the leather portfolio and the words a house your size would net close to $400,000. I found a pen in my purse, a ballpoint, the kind they give you at bank counters. Harriet had pressed it into my hand with the toast. And I found a small, water-stained notebook in the bottom of my suitcase that I'd used to track garden plantings for the last 2 seasons. I flipped past the tomato notes and the frost dates, and I started writing. I wrote down everything I could remember, every comment Lynette had made about the house in the last year, every time she'd used the word confused, the Sunday with Marcy, the way Elliot had nodded along to all of it. And then I wrote down the thing that was sitting in the back of my mind like a splinter I hadn't been able to locate. Her face when she said burned. How did that happen? Not how terrible, not my God, Teresa. Just, how did that happen? In that flat, waiting tone. I sat with that for a long time. The pen in my hand, the little notebook on my knee, the comfort in air conditioning blowing cold air on my ankles. Then I picked up my phone and I called my insurance company and I reported the fire and asked them to send an adjuster as soon as possible. Then I called my attorney. Well, Vera wasn't strictly my attorney. She was a woman I'd known for 20 years whose kids had played Little League with Elliot, who had become a family law attorney and then shifted into estate work. But she was sharp as a letter opener, and she returned calls same day. I left her a message. I said, "Vera, I need you to call me when you get a chance. Something happened, and I don't think it was an accident. I didn't have proof of anything yet. But I had a pen and a notebook and the particular kind of clarity that comes when you are 66 years old and you have nothing left to lose." Harriet showed up at the Comfort Inn the next morning with a covered casserole dish and 2 large coffees from the Dunkin' down the road. She set everything on the little desk by the window and she sat down in the only chair and she looked at me. She said, "The fire investigator came by the neighborhood yesterday." I said I knew. My insurance adjuster had mentioned it. She said he was asking people if they'd noticed anything unusual in the days before. She paused. She reached into the pocket of her windbreaker and she pulled out a small notepad, the kind with the wire spiral at the top, and she put it on the desk. She said, "I wrote this down back when it happened because it bothered me. The week before the fire, there was a car I didn't recognize parked across the street from your house. 2 evenings in a row. A dark blue sedan, older, I think a Chevy. And the person inside wasn't doing anything I could see. Just sitting. First time I saw it, I thought maybe it was someone waiting to pick up one of the Reston kids. But the second time, I thought that's the same car, and I wrote down the plate number. She slid the notepad across to me. There it was. 7 letters and numbers, neat as a postal route. I want to say something about Harriet here because she matters to this story, and I don't want to gloss over her. Harriet is not a dramatic person. She's a retired postal worker who spent 31 years delivering mail in our neighborhood, and who, as a result of those 31 years, noticed everything and trusted nothing to memory. She kept a calendar that went back 12 years. She wrote down license plates of unfamiliar cars the way some people write down grocery lists. It wasn't paranoia, it was just habit. Good habit, as it turned out. I took a picture of the plate number with my damaged phone. I said, "Harriet," did you tell the investigator about this? She said, I was about to this morning, but then I thought I should tell you first. I don't know what's going on, Teresa, but I know that you are not someone who burns her own house down, and I know that the night of the fire, your daughter-in-law didn't return my call for 3 days, which for a woman who calls me back about a noise complaint inside an hour is unusual. I asked her if she'd seen Lynette's number come up on the Ring camera she had on her front door. She said she had. We looked at each other. I said, don't tell anyone else about the plate number yet. Not the investigator, not anyone. Give me a week. She said, what are you going to do? I said, I didn't know yet, but I was going to start finding out. Patrice was a small woman in her 50s who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and carried a clipboard that looked like it had been through several previous investigations. She met me at the property on a gray Tuesday morning, and we stood on the front walk while she explained what they'd found. The structure was a total loss. I knew that already. What I didn't know was what she said next. She said the preliminary findings showed burn patterns that were inconsistent with accidental ignition. She said it carefully, the way people say things when they're choosing every word. The fire had started in 2 locations in the living room, which was unusual, and the burn pattern suggested the presence of an accelerant. I said, you mean someone said it? She said the investigation was open and they couldn't draw conclusions yet, but she wanted me to know that my claim was not in jeopardy. The policy covered arson by a third party, and that the fire department's investigator and her company would be working together. I asked if I was a suspect. She said no. My neighbor had confirmed I was in the house until she drove me away, and the timing and patterns were not consistent with the homeowner. I thanked her. I walked back to my rental car. I'd gotten a rental by then, a little Toyota, and I sat in it for a moment with both hands on the wheel. Someone had set my house on fire, on purpose. While I was inside, I'd been wondering if I was building a story out of nothing, the way people do when they're in shock, when they need an explanation that makes it someone else's fault. But Patrice hadn't asked me leading questions. She just told me what the patterns showed. I drove back to the Comfort Inn and I called Vera. This time she answered. Here is where I made my first big mistake. I want to own it because it's important and because it cost me. The plate number Harriet gave me led, through a favor from an old friend whose son worked in insurance fraud investigation, to a name. The car was registered to a man named Bart, 53 years old, did handyman and home repair work for cash, had worked for at least 3 people in my neighborhood over the past 2 years. I hired a private investigator. His name was Dennis, and he had an office above a dry cleaner on Route 9, and he charged me $225 a day, plus expenses. I gave him Bart's name and the plate number, and I told him I needed to know if this man had any connection to Lynette or Elliot. 2 weeks later, Dennis called me and told me that Bart had spent the week before the fire doing a bathroom renovation for a couple 2 doors down from my house. That was why he'd been parked on the street. He was a completely unremarkable handyman working a legitimate job. $780. Gone. 2 weeks. Gone. And worse, somehow, through some thread I still haven't been able to trace, Lynette found out I was asking questions. Elliot called me during that second week and said, I hear you've been talking to people, Mom. He said it in a worried son voice that I knew was not a worried son voice. He said, Lynette thinks you might be having some trouble processing everything. Confused. The word again, just wearing different clothes. I kept my voice very even. I said, I'm processing everything just fine, Elliot. Thank you for calling. After I hung up, I sat with the fact that I had wasted 2 weeks and nearly $800 chasing the wrong man, and that Lynette now knew I was looking, which meant she would be more careful, which meant I had to be more careful too. I took a breath. I started over. 11 days into my stay at the Comfort Inn, I know because I was marking them in the margin of my garden notebook, Elliot called again. This was different from the call about the questions. This one was structured, prepared. He said, Mom. Lynette and I have been talking and we're worried about you. We think—" He paused and I could hear him reading something. I could actually hear the faint rustle. "We think it might be worth looking at some assisted living options. Some of them are really lovely. Lynette found one about 15 minutes from us. It has a garden. You could—" I said, "Elliot, I don't want assisted living. I want my house back, or the money the insurance will give me for it." He said, "We just want you to be safe, Mom." I said, "I am safe. I am sitting in a hotel room with a working phone and a sound mind, and I am safe." He said, "It's just a house that size for one person at your age." I said, "Elliot, honey, I need to go. I have a call with my attorney." I didn't have a call with Vera right at that moment, but I called her as soon as I hung up and I told her about the conversation. I said, "He's either reading a script or he's so deep in this that he thinks it's his own idea." "Either way, they're still pushing," Vera said. "Let them push. Let them think you're confused and grieving and running out of options. People who think they've already won get careless." I wrote that down in the garden notebook. People who think they've already won get careless. I had a detached garage, old one, wood frame, separate from the house. The fire didn't reach it. The firefighters had soaked it down as a precaution, and the inside smelled like wet wood and gasoline, but it was standing. I hadn't thought about the garage in the first days after the fire. I was thinking about the house, about the rooms, about what was gone. But on a Thursday morning 3 weeks out, a gray, cold Thursday, the kind of day where the light never quite arrives, I put on rubber gloves and I went back. I had kept a filing box in the garage, metal, fireproof, the kind you get at an office supply store. Raymond had insisted on it when he was alive. He'd had a thing about redundancy, keeping copies of important documents somewhere separate from the originals. "Keep the originals in the house and the copies in the garage," he used to say. "If one goes, the other's still there." Raymond, always thinking 3 steps ahead. The box was there, dented, smoke-stained on the outside, but the seal had held. I opened it on the hood of the rental car. There were copies of the mortgage documents, the deed, the paid-off title, Raymond's life insurance policy, 3 years of bank statements, my property tax records going back to 2009, and at the bottom of the box, in a manila envelope I didn't immediately recognize, a document I hadn't put there. I stood in the cold garage for a moment looking at it. It was a formal property appraisal for my house, dated 14 months earlier, commissioned by a woman named Lynette. Not commissioned by me, commissioned by Lynette. She'd hired someone to appraise my property without my knowledge, 14 months before the fire. The appraiser's estimated value was listed on the cover sheet, $387,000. There were handwritten notes in the margin, numbers, calculations. What I could see, if you subtracted estate fees and a real estate commission, was a bottom line, a net. What someone would walk away with. I don't know how it got into my filing box. My best guess, later, was that Lynette had put it there herself during one of her Sunday visits, thinking it was a private spot to store her planning documents. She'd probably forgotten about it entirely. My hands were completely steady when I put it back in the envelope. I can't explain that, but they were. I drove straight to Vera's office. Vera looked at the appraisal for a long time. She turned it over. She looked at the handwritten margin notes. She set it down on her desk and she took her reading glasses off and she said, "This is premeditation, Teresa. A year before the fire, she's calculating the net proceeds. That's not someone who was going to pressure you into selling. That's someone with a timeline." I said I knew. She said, "I need to make copies of this and get the original into evidence storage today." She made 3 photocopies on her office machine. She gave me one. She kept one. She put the original into a manila envelope and sealed it and wrote the date and her initials across the seal. She said she'd hand deliver it to the fire investigator's office in the morning. 2 days later, she called me. Her voice was careful. She said, "Teresa, the storage facility where I keep client documents was broken into last night. My file cabinet was one of the ones they targeted. I already knew what she was going to say. The original appraisal was gone. I sat down on the edge of the hotel bed. I said, "Were any other files taken?" She said, "Just a few. Mine were the ones most disturbed. It wasn't random. Someone had known where to look, and that meant someone had been watching Vera's office or had found out somehow that I'd taken the document there. I thought about Elliot's call, the careful questions. "We hear you've been asking around." I said, "What about the photocopy?" Vera said, "A photocopy is admissible. It's not as strong as the original. They can challenge the authenticity more easily. But it's not nothing. We build around it. We build around it." That was all we had. I hung up and I sat for a long time. And then I opened the garden notebook and I drew a line through the strategy I'd been building, and I started a new page. I want to tell you something about Vera that helps explain why I trusted her with this. Vera Ashworth had spent 12 years as a family law attorney watching people lie under oath about money. Not once in those 12 years, she told me, had she met anyone who did it subtly. Greed, she said, is not subtle. It leaves trails. It cannot help itself. She was not rattled by the stolen document. She was, and I say this as a compliment, annoyed. Productively annoyed. The kind of annoyed that gets organized. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon 3 days after the break-in and said, "Here's where we are. The fire investigator's office has independently subpoenaed Lynette's phone records for the 6 weeks before the fire. My source at the county attorney's office tells me they're focused on a series of outgoing calls, and someone Lynette was in contact with has apparently been forthcoming." I said, "Forthcoming how?" She said, "Someone is talking. I don't have details yet, but the investigator called me this morning and asked if you would be available to give a formal statement next week. That's not a courtesy call, Teresa. That's them building towards something." I said, "What do I need to do?" She said, "You need to give your statement clearly and without speculation. You tell them what you observed, the way Lynette looked when you told her about the fire, the appraisal, the Sunday with the realtor, the comments about your confusion, all of it, in order, as specifically as you can remember it." She said, "And then you let me do the rest." I said, "Okay." I called Harriet that night and told her what was happening. She said, "I knew it. I knew it the minute she didn't call back for 3 days. I told her I needed her to give her formal statement too, the plate number, the dates she saw the car, all of it. She said she'd already been planning to. She said she'd pressed flowers the page she'd written it on to make sure the ink didn't fade. That's Harriet. That is exactly Harriet." The investigator's name was Sergeant Delacroix, and he had the manner of a man who had heard every possible version of every possible lie, and had stopped being surprised by any of them sometime around the mid-90s. He was perfectly courteous. He took notes on a yellow legal pad. He did not tell me more than he had to. But Vera had a contact in the county attorney's office who was willing to share what the phone records had shown, and Vera told me. In the 6 weeks before the fire, Lynette had called a number 17 times. The number belonged to a man who did handyman work for cash and had a prior arrest, not convicted, but arrested, in connection with a suspicious fire at a commercial property 4 years earlier. The last call from Lynette's phone to that number had been made the night before my house burned. Elliot's phone showed 2 calls to the same number, one 3 weeks before the fire, one the day before. 2 calls. He told the detectives, when they interviewed him, that he hadn't known what Lynette was planning, that she'd led him to believe they were just going to use the fire as an opportunity, that somehow, mysteriously, it would just be an accident, and then Teresa would be left with no house and a settlement check and nowhere to go, and they would step in to manage it all. He'd told himself it wasn't really what it was. That's the story he was living with when he called me to suggest assisted living. That's the story he'd built to make it possible to look his mother in the eye. 2 calls to the man who set the fire. I thought about him standing in the doorway in his sweatpants, his careful blankness, the way he wouldn't look at me. I didn't feel sorry for him, but I understood him, which was somehow worse. The detectives interviewed Elliot and Lynette separately, which is standard procedure and also, I'm told, extremely effective, because people who share a story never tell it quite the same way. Lynette, from what Vera's contact relayed, was composed. She had an explanation for everything. The phone calls were about home repairs. She'd never met the man in person. The appraisal was just, she'd been curious about property values. It was a normal thing to do. Elliot lasted 40 minutes. Vera told me this on the phone, and I wrote it down in the garden notebook. 40 minutes. He cried, apparently. He told them the plan had been Lynette's idea entirely. He said she'd told him the insurance payout would be barely enough for Teresa to live on, that they needed to move quickly before I spent it down on a new property, that if they had power of attorney, they could guide me into assisted living and manage the money properly. He said he hadn't known she was going to hire someone to start the fire. He thought she meant pressure, suggestion, a slow, managed campaign. The detectives asked him about his 2 phone calls to the handyman. He said Lynette had told him to make one of the calls. He didn't know why. He hadn't asked. He was 42 years old and he hadn't asked. I've had a long time to think about my son, about how someone raised with love and security becomes someone who doesn't ask why his wife is calling a man who sets fires. I think the answer is that it's easier than we'd like to believe. I think love, even good love, even real love, can be slowly replaced with something else if you're not careful, with dependency, with the need to keep the peace, with the particular cowardice of someone who tells himself the outcome will justify what he didn't ask. I didn't stop loving Elliot. I just stopped expecting anything from him that he hadn't already proven he could give. It was a Tuesday. I was sitting in the Comfort Inn eating a cup of Chobani yogurt, plain with a little honey from one of those single-serve packets. And my phone rang. It was Vera. She said, "They made the arrests this morning." I set the yogurt down on the nightstand very carefully. She said Lynette was taken in from her office, Elliot from the house. Both are in custody. The county attorney is filing arson conspiracy and elder financial abuse charges. I said, "Okay." She said, "Teresa, are you all right?" I sat there for a moment with my hand on my phone and the yogurt on the nightstand and the Comfort Inn air conditioning blowing cold air on my ankles, same as always. I said, "Yes, I think I am." I didn't feel what I thought I would feel. I'd spent enough time imagining this moment, in the garden notebook, in the dark at 2 a.m., in the rental car on drives that went nowhere, that I'd built it into something large and dramatic in my head, a release. A roar. What I actually felt was very quiet, like a long tension going out of my shoulders all at once, like the moment after you've been holding your breath and you realize you've stopped. I said, "What happens next?" Vera said, "Now we go to trial." The trial lasted 9 days. I was present for all of them. The photocopy of the appraisal came in. Vera's team brought in a document examiner who testified that the photocopy was consistent with authentic production, that the handwritten margin notes were consistent with Lynette's known writing samples, and that the calculations in the margins matched the figures from the formal appraisal report on file with the appraiser's office, who, it turned out, still had digital records of the commission. That was the piece I hadn't known about. The appraiser had records, everything she'd sent to Lynette, every email, every draft, every invoice. They hadn't been stolen because they were in a server, not a filing cabinet. The handyman, whose name I won't put in this account out of the small mercy of not making him any more famous than he already became, testified for the prosecution. He had been caught on a traffic camera near my neighborhood on the night of the fire. He had called Lynette from a burner phone the morning after. He took a plea agreement in exchange for his testimony, the phone records, the margin notes, the appraiser's digital files, the handyman's testimony. Lynette's attorney argued the documents were circumstantial, the phone calls were coincidental, and the handyman was an unreliable witness with motive to lie. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. Guilty on arson conspiracy. Guilty on elder financial abuse. 7 years. Elliot had taken a plea weeks before the trial. 3 years with the possibility of parole at 18 months. He did not look at me during his sentencing. I sat in the second row and I watched the side of his face, and I thought about the peach pound cake and the gap-toothed smile and the night I drove him home from the hospital in a car seat we'd borrowed from the neighbors because we couldn't afford a new one. Then the judge spoke and the bailiff moved and my son was led out of the room. I walked out into a gray November afternoon and Vera was beside me and Harriet, who had driven herself, who had testified about the plate number in a voice so steady and precise that the defense attorney didn't even cross-examine her. Harriet was there, too, with her coat buttoned to the chin. Nobody said anything for a minute. Then Harriet said, "I could use some coffee." And that was about right. 6 months after the conviction, I bought a house, smaller than the old one. A lot smaller, actually. 3 bedrooms, which is 2 more than I strictly need, but I wanted the option. A screened porch on the back. A garden that starts small but has good bones. That's how I described it to the realtor, who was not Marcy, who was a quiet woman named Renata, who showed me 12 houses before I found this one. The insurance settlement covered most of it. The civil judgment, Vera had filed a civil suit alongside the criminal case, and we'd won that, too, covered the rest and left me with something sitting in savings that Raymond would have called a cushion. He was always talking about cushions. Financial cushions, practical cushions, the kind you build slowly and quietly and never touch unless you have to. I touched a little of it. I bought a new armchair, dark green fabric, very sturdy, nothing fancy, not the same as the old one. I wasn't looking for the same, but good, solid. My neighbor on the new street is a widower named Edward. He's been on the block for 12 years, retired from the Parks Department, keeps a vegetable garden that is frankly better than mine, which I consider a professional challenge. The day I moved in, he brought sandwiches, turkey and provolone from the deli 2 streets over. He set them on the kitchen counter and said, "You've got a good screened porch. I've had my eye on that porch for years." I said, "You're welcome to the porch anytime." He said, "I'll take you up on that." He has. We have sat on that porch together, drinking sweet tea, more times than I can count now. We haven't put a name on it. I don't think we need to. We are 2 people in our late 60s who have lived enough to know that something quiet and warm and easy to be around is not a small thing. It is not a small thing at all. I heard the doorbell on a Sunday morning in April. I wasn't expecting anyone. Edward was in the garden, arguing politely with a tomato plant, and I went to the front door in my reading glasses with a cup of coffee in my hand, and through the glass I saw a young woman I hadn't seen in 2 years. Alexandra is Elliot's daughter from his first marriage. She's 26, brown hair, blue eyes, the eyes that run on Raymond's side of the family, the ones Elliot has, the ones I see in pictures of my own mother as a young woman. She was standing on my porch with a baby on her hip, a boy maybe 6 months old, round-cheeked and blinking in the morning light. I opened the door. She said, "Grandma." I wasn't sure you'd open it. I said, "I almost didn't." She said, I know I don't have the right to just show up. I needed you to see him, and I needed to say something to your face, not in a letter." I stepped back and I let her in. She sat on the couch and she held the baby and she told me what she knew, and when she'd known it. She said Lynette had kept her at a distance for years. Lauren had always been jealous of Elliot's attachment to his first daughter, had slowly made Sunday dinners awkward and holidays complicated until Alexandra just stopped coming around. She said she'd heard rumors in the months before the fire that Lynette was talking a lot about my house, about my age, about my ability to manage things on my own. She said she hadn't understood how far it went. She said, "I should have called you. I should have warned you. I chose the easy thing instead." I said, "Yes, you did." She didn't flinch. She didn't argue or explain or shift blame. She just nodded. I said, "Alexandra, that silence cost me my home. It cost me a year of my life and my sense of safety and my trust in my own son. I need you to understand that before we say anything else. She said, I understand, and I don't expect forgiveness today. I just want you to know I'm not my father, and I don't want my son to grow up not knowing you. I looked at the baby. He was looking at me with that wide, serious gaze that babies have, like they're trying to figure out if you're worth the effort. I said, what's his name? She said, Emmett. After Grandpa Raymond. Emmett Raymond. I held out my hands. She put him in them. He grabbed my thumb with his whole fist and held on. I said, come in, Alexandra. I'll make tea and we'll talk. But I need you to understand something first. She said, okay. I said, this house is my home. What I have here is mine, and it took me a hard year to build it. If you come back into my life, it has to be honest. No secrets, no half-truths, no loyalty divided between me and your father when your father is the reason I was standing in the rain outside a closed door at 10 o'clock at night. She said, I promise. I nodded. I said, then come in. Edward came in from the garden about 20 minutes later, dirt on his knees, and found the three of us at the kitchen table. He looked at the baby, and the baby looked at him, and then the baby made a sound like a very small person expressing a very clear opinion, and Edward laughed. He sat down, and I introduced them. He made fresh coffee. Alexandra held her cup in both hands and told us about her life. The accounting job she'd gone back to, the small apartment, the way she was figuring out how to be a single mother, the way I had been a single woman for a long time, which is one careful day at a time. We talked for 2 hours. When she left, she hugged me at the door. Not a long hug, not a tearful one. The kind of hug that asks a question rather than assuming an answer. I said, same time next Sunday. She smiled. She carried Emmett out to her car and buckled him in, and I watched from the porch until they turned the corner. Edward came and stood beside me. He said, "You doing okay?" I said, "Yes, I think so." He said, "That was a good thing you did." I said, "Don't get sentimental. I just want to know my grandson." He laughed. He went back to the tomato plant. 3 months have passed since Alexandra came to the door, and this is what my life looks like now. Harriet comes for lunch every Tuesday. She brings the same peppermint candies she always has in her coat pocket, and we sit on the screened porch. Edward's porch, she calls it, to tease me. And we drink iced tea and talk about everything and nothing. We have been friends for 23 years, and the friendship is different now, denser. The kind that forms between people who have been through something together and come out the other side knowing each other better than they did going in. She doesn't ask about Elliot. I'm grateful for that. Alexandra comes on Sundays. Emmett is growing the way babies do, faster than seems possible, and he has developed a specific and enthusiastic attachment to Edward that I find both touching and a little funny. Edward reads to him from whatever book he happens to have on hand. Last Sunday, it was a field guide to mid-Atlantic birds. Emmett listened with the total absorption of someone who hasn't yet learned to be bored. I wrote to Elliot once, a letter, not long. I told him I didn't have anything to forgive right now, that forgiveness wasn't the word for what I was working through. I told him I hoped he was using the time well. I told him to remember who he was before all of this, and to figure out if that person was still available. He hasn't written back. I didn't expect him to right away. Lynette's attorney filed an appeal in January. It was denied in March. I found out from Vera on a Thursday afternoon while I was repotting a rosemary plant on the back steps. I set down the trowel. I called Vera back and said thank you. Then I finished the repotting. The rosemary is doing well. Everything in the garden is doing well. This morning I got up before Edward. He sleeps later than I do, always has. And I made coffee and I took it out to the screened porch, and I sat in the morning light, and I wrote in the garden notebook. Not garden notes, just thoughts. The way I've been doing for the past year when I need to put something down outside my own head. What I wrote this morning was something like, I did not survive this because I was strong. I survived it because I paid attention, because Harriet kept a notepad, because Vera got angry in a useful direction, because Raymond taught me to keep copies of important things somewhere separate, because when you build a life with care and intention over 43 years, some of what you built is in the walls and the floors and the roof, yes, and some of it is in you, and nobody can set fire to what's in you. Lynette thought she was taking my house. She was only taking the house. I heard Emmett start to fuss in the spare bedroom. Alexandra had stayed over on Saturday, too tired to drive. And then the fussing stopped, and I heard Edward's voice, low and even, reading to him. The field guide again, I think, or maybe the novel he'd started last month. Either way. I sat on the porch and drank my coffee and watched the sun come up over the garden. It was a good morning. It was a good life. It is mine. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.